There's a pattern that keeps showing up in completely different places: ancient religious texts, mystical philosophy, modern physics, even internet subcultures. That pattern is simple. Reality might not be fundamental, it might be layered. And that's what's strange, isn't that people believe this? It's the idea that keeps resurfacing in systems that were never supposed to overlap. We're going to follow that pattern down a small iceberg of esoteric concepts. Some of these ideas are familiar by name, others are obscure, but when you start placing them next to each other, something starts to form. Sacred geometry. Sacred geometry is usually introduced as a visual language, a way of describing certain shapes, ratios that appear repeatedly in nature, art, and architecture. Most people encounter it casually, in spirals, flowers, shells, and geometric designs that feel aesthetically pleasing without needing much explanation. At that level, it's easy to treat sacred geometry as decoration, something humans noticed and copied because it looked nice. What makes it interesting is how it's consistently that these same patterns appear, not just in nature, but across cultures that have never interacted with one another. One of the most common examples is the Fibonacci spiral. This pattern shows up in a way that leaves grow around a stem, the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, and the shape of certain shells. What's unsettling about it is it just exists. It's the same ratio that keeps appearing in systems that weren't designed or planned. Plants aren't choosing efficiency, shells aren't following blueprints, and yet the same structure keeps emerging. That same ratio also appears in ancient architecture and artwork, not because those builders understood modern mathematics, but because they believed that these proportions reflected something fundamentally about reality. For a long time, these patterns weren't seen as coincidences, they were understood as evidence of underlying order to exist. In ancient Greece, philosophers believed numbers and ratios formed the foundation of the universe. Harmony wasn't just musical, it was mathematical. Polygoras and his followers believed reality could be understood through proportion. That number wasn't just a tool for measurement, it was something closer to the truth. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, geometric diagrams were used as tools for meditation, not because they were beautiful, but because they believed to reflect how reality itself was structured. These diagrams weren't meant to represent stories or gods, they were meant to represent relationships between space, form, and consciousness. Medieval Christian architecture followed similar ideas. Cathedrals built using specific proportions meant to mirror a divine order. The structure itself considered an act of understanding and not just construction. Light, height, and geometric were carefully controlled, not to impress, but to align the physical space with something believed to exist beyond it. Across these cultures, the interperception differed, but the assumption stayed the same, that these patterns weren't invented by humans, they were discovered. At a surface level, there are reasonable explanations for this. Nature follows rules, physics creates repetition, and humans naturally recognize and imitate what they see. But the explanation doesn't fully account for the meaning of these patterns were given, or they were treated as something closer to the knowledge than decoration. Sacred geometry wasn't just about observing shape, it was about believing that reality itself was a structure that could be partially understood. That belief carries an implication that's easy to miss, that chaos isn't the default state of existence. Instead of randomness slowly becoming ordered, the assumption was that the order was already existed, and what humans were seeing was only a reflection of it. The idea shows up again and again, not a scientific claim, but as an intuition, that the universe isn't just behaving according to the rules, it's expressing something. When people talk about sacred geometry today, it is often stripped of that content, reduced to visuals or trends or surface level symbolism. What gets lost in the original discomfort behind the idea, thus suggesting that structure might exist independently of observation, that patterns don't emerge because they were looking for them, we notice them because they were already there. If that's true, then we experience as reality may not be chaotic at all. It may be ordered in ways only partially understood. Sacred geometry doesn't explain what that order is. It doesn't tell us where it comes from. It simply introduced the possibility that reality has a structure beneath what we see, and once this possibility is introduced, it becomes harder to treat patterns as meaningless. Kabbalah. Kabbalah is often described as a form of Jewish mysticism, which isn't wrong, but it doesn't really explain what the Kabbalah is trying to accomplish. At its core, the Kabbalah is less concerned with visions or rituals and more concerned with structure. Specifically, it attempts to explain how something infinite gives rise to something finite, and how an abstract source becomes a physical world that can be experienced. Rather than treating reality as a single layer, Kabbalah describes experience as a process made up of stages that moves gradually from the unseen to the visible. The most well expression of this framework is the tree of life. It is usually shown as a diagram with 10 points connected by lines, and at first glance it looks symbolic or decorative. Originally, it wasn't used that way. The tree of life was treated as a functional map. Each point of these trees represents a specific role in the process of existence, not emotions or personalities, but operations that describe how reality unfolds. Concepts like limitation, balance, expansions, resistance, and expressions are used to explain something unified becomes divided. And what matters here is that the system wasn't meant to be metaphorical. Kabbalah is treated as a literal description of how reality operates beneath appearances. According to this view, reality follows a flow rather than emerging randomly. That flow begins in abstraction and moves toward consciousness. The physical world occupies the lowest position in this structure. It's not because it's evil or corrupt, but because it's the most constrained. It is the point where the structure becomes fixed enough to be experienced as a matter, time, and separation. Everything above it is limited, more flexible, and less directed visibly. As we move upward in the framework, reality becomes harder to perceive, but less restricted by form. This introduces an important shift in perspective. What we experience isn't the whole structure of reality, but the final stage of a much larger process. Another central idea in Kabbalah is concealment, that belief that reality is intentionally filtered, not to deceive, but to make experience possible at all. If the infinite were fully present without limitation, nothing finite could exist independently. There would be no distinction between observer and observed, and no perspective from which experience could occur. Because of this, reality is described as a layer and gradual. Each layer reduces complexity just enough to allow perception, interaction, and moving to form. This is why Kabbalah places such emphasis on understanding structure rather than belief or obedience. Understanding what was seen as a way of aligning with how reality actually functions rather than accepting ideas on faith alone. Over time, these teachings become restricted. Kabbalist studies were limited to small groups, often older scholars who believed to be psychologically stable enough to engage with ideas that could radically alter perception. That restriction shaped Kabbalah is viewed today, but the concern wasn't about the secrecy for its own sake, it was about impact. Once this framework is taken seriously, everyday experiences begin to feel different. Events stop feeling isolated and start to feel connected by structure rather than coincidence. Cause and effect begin to feel layered, and meaning feels distributed rather than obvious. Kabbalah doesn't tell you what to believe about the world, it offers a system and leaves you to sit with implications. If reality is structured and experience is filtered, then what we interact with every day may only be a surface level, not false but incomplete. And once the idea is introduced, it becomes difficult to see the world as a fully self-contained. Everything starts to feel like a part of a larger process that continues to beyond immediate perception. Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels refer to a group of early Christian texts that were excluded from the Bible, despite being written around the same period as many canon scriptures. What distinguishes these texts is not only their theology, but the way they frame reality, knowledge, and human perception. Rather than focusing on faith, obedience, or intuitional authority, these writings emphasize knowledge as the central mechanism for understanding existence. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek gaianos, meaning knowledge, but in the context it refers directly to insight rather than the belief or education. In many Gnostic traditions, the physical world is treated as incomplete or misaligned. It is not necessarily described as evil, but as a place where the truth is obscured rather than clearly revealed. The perspective represents a major departure from later Christian doctrine, which framed creation as fundamentally ordered and good. Gnostic texts instead suggest that the structure of the world itself may contribute to the misunderstanding rather than clarity. A clear example of the worldwide view appears in the Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the narrative-driven Gospels found in the New Testament, these texts contain no story of Jesus' life, death, or resurrection. Instead, it presents a collection of the sayings attributed to Jesus, instead of being impercepted rather than explained. The text assumes that meaning is not delivered through events or authority, but through recognition and understanding. One of the most discussed passages suggests that the kingdom is not located in the sky or beneath the earth, but is already spread across the world, unseen by most people. This implies that reality itself is not lacking, but the human perception fails to recognize what is present. Within the framework, ignorance rather than moral failure becomes the primary obstacle to understanding. Salvation is not framed as forgiveness or reward, as a form of awakening or remembrance. Some Gnostic texts extend this idea further by questioning the nature of creation itself. They introduce the concept of a lesser creator figure, often referred to as the demiurge, who is responsible for shaping the material world without full awareness of a higher divine source. This figure is not always portrayed as malicious, but as limited or incomplete, and the world that results from the limitation reflects that constraint. The physical world is therefore not false, but unfinished. The interperception carries significant consequences. If reality is structured in layers and perception is limited, then the authority based solely on visible structures becomes unstable. Personal insight takes precedence over hierarchy, and understanding becomes internal rather than externally granted. This poses a fundamental challenge to emerging religious intuitions. As Christian doctrine became more centralized, texts that encouraged independent interperception were increasingly marginalized. The Gnostic writings were eventually labeled heretical and removed from official scripture. In 1945, a collection of these texts were discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt. Having been hidden for centuries, their preservation suggests that they were intentionally concealed rather than forgotten. When scholars translated these writings, it became clear that early Christianity was far more diverse than commonly assumed. There was no single agreed upon understanding of the reality of salvation or authority. What makes the Gnostic Gospels unsettling is that they challenge the assumptions behind the questions themselves. Instead of explaining how to live within the world, they ask whether the world operates the way it appears to. They do not demand rejection of reality, but encourage reconsideration of how reality is perceived and interpercepted. Once the perspective is adopted, meaning becomes less fixed and authority less absolute. The Gnostic Gospel suggests that reality may be layered, filtered, and partially hidden, and that understanding it requires more than acceptance, it requires perception. The Gateway Process. The Gateway Process refers to a series of experiments conducted in the late 20th century that attempted to study human consciousness in a controlled, systematic way. Unlike spiritual traditions or philosophical systems, this research did not originate from religion or mysticism or the belief-based practice. It emerges from institutional research environments interested in understanding perception, awareness, and altered states of consciousness. The work is most commonly associated with the morale, Institute, a private organization focused on studying how consciousness responds to specific stimuli. The research eventually drew the attention of the US military and the intelligence agencies, including the CIA. What made the gateway process unusual was not its conclusions, but its methodology. Rather than asking abstract questions about the meaning of the consciousness, the program focused on whether awareness could be altered in repeatable and measurable ways. The emphasis was placed on consistency rather than interpretation. To explore this, researchers used a technique known as sync, short for hemispheric synchronization. This method involves playing slightly different audio frequencies into each ear, forcing the brain to reconcile the difference. The reconciliation produces measurable changes in brainwave patterns, an effect that has often been observed through the EEG monitoring rather than subjective reporting alone. The underlying premise was that if the brain states influence perception, then including specific states might allow perception itself to shift in predictable ways. Participants were guided through structured audio sessions designed to move awareness away from normal waking consciousness while maintaining alertness. These sessions were not framed as a spiritual exercise, but as a mental training procedures. Subjects were instructed to maintain mentally aware while their bodies entered states typically associated with sleep or deep relaxation. The objective was to observe what happened when awareness persisted without normal physical engagement. According to the documentation, participants reported vivid internal imagery, altered perception of time, and a sense of detachment from physical surroundings. These reports were recorded without symbolic interpretation or philosophical framing. The gateway process materials describe consciousness as a system that can operate under different configurations depending on the internal conditions. Awareness is treated as something that can shift relative to sensory input rather than remaining fixed. The language used throughout this program is deliberately technical. Terms like energy, frequency, and vibrations are defined operationally rather than symbolically, and they are used to describe observed effects rather than the metaphysical claims. The documents repeatedly emphasize uncertainty and limitation. They do not present a complete model of reality, nor do they claim definitive explanations for the experiences described. What makes the program unsettling is that the framework it assumes that rather than the results it reports, it treats the perceptions as adjustable without automatically categorizing those adjustments as pathological or imagery. The research does not claim that the altered states reveal ultimate truth. It suggests that the normal waking awareness may represent only one possible configuration of the consciousness. This places the gateway process in an uncomfortable position. It is too structured and documented to be dismissed as mysticism, but too unconventional to be easily integrated into mainstream scientific models. Interest in the program eventually declined, but not because the findings were disproven, but because their practical applications remained unclear. The research produced more questions than conclusions. What remains a detailed record of experiments that treated perception as something that could be modified under specific conditions. The gateway process does not define what consciousness ultimately is. It introduces the possibility that how we experience reality depends on the setting rather than absolutes, and settings by definitions can change. Reality as a filter. The idea that reality is filtered begins with a basic limitation of human perception. We do not experience the world directly, but through biological systems that evolved to prioritize survival rather than completeness. Our senses are not neutral instruments designed to show reality as it is. They are selective mechanisms that filter information before it ever reaches consciousness, awareness. Vision provides a clear example of this limitation. Human eyes only detect a narrow band of electromagnetic spectrum. which we refer to as visible light. Outside the narrow range exists radio waves, infrared and ultraviolet X-rays, and gamma rays, all accompanying the same physical space we do. They are not hidden from us in a mysterious sense, but excluded by the limits of our sensory equipment. This means that what we call reality is already edited at the most basic level of experience. Before interpretation begins, selection has already occurred. The same principle applies to sound. Humans can only hear vibrations within a specific frequency range, while frequencies outside the range continue to exist without being perceived. Touch, smell, taste operate under similar constraints. Each sense captures only a small slice of available information, shaped by what we historically have been useful for navigation and survival. Even our experience of time is filtered. The brain assembles discrete moments into a continuous narrative, creating the impression of a small flow rather than the individual instance. None of these limitations are controversial. They are well documented in neuroscience and biology. What becomes unsettling is the implication of taking them seriously. If perception filters reality at every level, then experience itself is not a direct encounter with the world as it is. It exists independently. Instead, experience functions more like an interface, a simplified representation that allows interaction without revealing the full system underneath. This does not mean reality is false, simulated, or illusionary. This means reality is meditated. The brain does not attempt to show us everything that exists. It shows us what is useful enough to function. That usefulness shapes how the world appears to us. Objects feel solid, time feels continuous, and identity feels stable because those impressions support coherence and survival. When perception is altered, even slightly, those assumptions can begin to loosen. This can occur through exhaustion, meditation, trauma, or changes in the neurological state. In those moments, the structure of experience can change even though external environments remain the same. That alone suggests that what we experience as reality depends heavily on the internal configuration. If perception can be adjusted, then what we consider normal awareness is not the default state of reality itself. It is one configuration among many possible configurations. The idea connects everything discussed earlier without requiring speculation. Patterns observed in nature, structural models of reality, hidden knowledge, traditions, and intuitional studies of the consciousness all converge on the same underlying observation. Reality appears layered, not because of mysticism, but because the perception is limited. What we experience may represent a surface level produced by biology and cognitive constraints. Other layers may exist outside those constraints, inaccessible, not because they are hidden, but because we are not equipped to perceive them. This does not imply that those layers are meaningful, intentional, or relevant to human life, only that they may exist independently of awareness. The unsettling part is what we might exist beyond perception. It is how little of existence we are structurally capable of noticing. Once the idea is accepted, reality no longer feels like it's a fixed environment that we simply observe. It begins to feel confidential, shaped by limits, interpretation, and internal structure. Reality as we experience it may not be wrong, but it may be incomplete. But if that's the case, then the understanding reality is not only about acquiring new information, it is also about recognizing the filters through which all information must pass.